So, Carol, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about elbows and elbow anatomy. Would you be able to give a quick introduction to yourself and your expertise?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great place to start because I think it's important to know where your information is coming from. And just, I'm not a medically trained person. I don't have a degree in kinesiology. I'm just a movement teacher. Well, not just, but I'm a movement teacher, which means that, I'm a very keen researcher. So I read a lot and I have been studying anatomy for a long time with some great teachers. But everything you hear from me is my opinion. And if you're interested in anything I have to say, it should be a jumping off point to your own research, as opposed to the be all and end all kind of, this is the factual kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's all theory. Anatomy is all theory, really.
Perfect. So the reason I want to talk about elbow anatomy is it's definitely one of the areas in hand balancing practice that comes up a lot, right? So either people have elbow hyperextension, they get elbow pain just from, that amount of load on their hands, or, there's people with larger carrying angles who it kind of sometimes looks like their arms are bent when they're in a handstand, even though they're trying to straighten them. So it's definitely a topic that comes up a lot for handstand. So I was hoping we could just start with what is an elbow kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, so I have some arm models here, but let's just talk about limbs in general. So humans have a lower and an upper limb. And they're remarkably similar in that they both attach to the trunk with a ball and socket joint. There's a long cylindrical bone, one bone that ends in a joint that can both flex and rotate.
Right.
And then there's two smaller long cylindrical bones that are attached by a membrane. And then there's a bunch of little bones, and then there's 5 long bones, and then 5 digits.
Right.
So in the lower limb, we have the knee, and in the upper limb, we have the elbow. And the reason we have these joints is so that we can bring our distal parts, which are the parts that, that are mobile, closer to us. So, for example, we wouldn't be able to sit like this if we didn't have knees.
Right.
And we wouldn't be able to squat. It would be very difficult to climb, So it's the ability to bring your foot closer to your hip, essentially. And with the elbow, it's the ability to bring your hand closer to your mouth, or, for self-grooming. So that's the reason we have these joints in the middle. But they come with a kind of an inherent instability, right? So it's not a perfect scenario, but it's the best case. So the difference between the knees and the elbows is that the knee can only rotate when the knee is bent. And that's a really good thing when you think about it, because if you're standing straight on a straight leg, you don't want your upper body to be flinging wildly around as your feet stand straight. So, but when you lift your foot up to, let's say, climb up on something, you have the option to turn your foot relative to the hip.
Right.
So that you can meet whatever ground is coming at you. So the elbow can rotate regardless of the degree of extension or flexion. It's called bend or straight. So you can, if you just extend your arm out in front of you with I call this the elbow crease. So I don't know what you call it. Palm facing forward, inside of elbow facing forward. Straighten the elbow all the way, hyperextend if you've got it. And then let's bend the wrist back so that the fingers are pointing down, and keeping the elbow crease pointing up, rotate the forearm so that the fingers point up. So there you've got 180 degrees of rotation more or less, and there's your handstand position, right? So you can rotate your hand in any direction regardless of what your shoulder's doing, if your elbow's straight or bent. So that gives us a really wide range of motion in terms of grasping and turning, and your arm can be anywhere and you can still do that lower limb movement. So that's one major difference between the knee and the elbow. And the other one is that at the end of your thigh bone, there's 2 condyles, which are like if you think of a dog milk bone, right? So the way a kid draws a bone, it's like it has these two bumps at the end. So there's two, they call them the femoral condyles, and they sit on the top of the tibia, which is the lower leg bone. And that's it. The only restriction to knee range of motion is ligament or muscle.
Right.
There is no real bony end range to the knee. So that can be problematic. But this is our main weight-bearing limb ordinarily. So even if you do handstands. So we tend to have much stronger leg muscles that stabilize our knee. With the elbow, there's a bony end range. So there's 3 restrictions to the end range of the elbow. There's the bony end range, and we'll go through what that is. And then there's ligament. So there's ligaments on the side and there's ligaments on the front.
Yeah. And
it's the ones on the front that we're going to be more concerned with in a hyperextended elbow. And then there's the muscles. Right? So there's three end ranges of motion. So let's look at the elbow joint. So if you're not familiar with anatomy, I always say like anatomy it's not important to memorize it, right? It's just a language. So you don't feel embarrassed if you don't speak Mandarin, right? If you run into somebody on the street that needs directions and you need, you would just Google how do you say subway in Mandarin. But so anatomy to me is something that you can just look up. You don't have to memorize the name of muscles or bones or anything like that. So when I teach, I usually say the anatomical term in case you're interested in learning that language. But I also will give it just like instead of flex your elbow, I'll just like bend your elbow. So right. Both the same thing. So I'm going to talk about the joint of the elbow in terms of imagery so that it makes sense, right? If you have a really complex system going on, it helps to simplify your models. So the end of the arm bone, so this is a right arm, and this is the humerus. The name of the bone is the humerus. And it ends a little bit like the leg bone does, like the milk bone, but it's a lumpier, it's not as round.
Okay.
So, but because we're going to simplify this model, let's just imagine like 2 light bulbs sitting together side by side. The old-fashioned kind, not the the idea kind. So they're sitting together, and that's the end of your arm bone. And then on the bottom of the light bulbs, you're going to stick a spool of thread, but without the thread. So a spool of thread is like a cylinder with 2 caps on the end. So you've got it on its side. So you're going to stick that up onto the light bulbs. And on the end of the spool, you're going to stick a little ball. It's just a partial ball. It's not a full ball. So you've got, the 2 bones and then kind of a cylinder running horizontally, and then you've got a rounded shape.
Okay.
All right. So that is what the end of the humerus looks like. But now you have to imagine that as the humerus is coming straight down from the shoulder, the light bulbs aren't straight down pointing to the ground. They're actually angled forward a little bit.
Right.
So you take those light bulbs and you kind of turn them, the bottom of them, so they're facing forward a little bit when the shoulder is neutral. So that means the spool of thread and the little round ball are not on the same axis as the shaft of the bone. They're forward of it about 45 degrees, which is considerable.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the 2 lower bones, the ulna, it's called the ulna, and that's the one that's associated with your elbow, and it's larger at the top and smaller at the bottom. It articulates with the spool.
Okay.
And at the back of it, it has we call the elbow, right? The elbow bone. Its anatomical name is the olecranon, and I've heard it pronounced several ways. So if you're not sure of your pronunciation, just decide which way you want to pronounce it. So I'll call it the olecranon here. Although whenever in my head, I always say olecranon. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it, but that's how you read it.
So that's like this part.
So let's find that on our own bones. So I'm going to extend my right arm out in front of me with the elbow crease in the palm facing forward, and with the thumb and let's do the middle finger of our left hand. Put your thumb on the inside, and you'll find the side of that, it's bonier than a light bulb, but that's the side of the light bulb. And then find the other one on the other side. You might have to displace some tissue. So when you bend your arm at the elbow, those bones don't move. They shouldn't move if you're on the bottom of the humerus. And now take your index finger and put it on the olecranon, which is the point of your elbow. And if your arm is straight, the elbow will be kind of parked. Right. And when you bend your elbow, it will kind of move down and forward. So if you look at these 3 points, right, if I should have brought like a marker, but if I put 2 points here and 1 here, right now there's a triangle. Yeah. And when I extend my elbow, they're all in line. It's a line. Okay. So the olecranon moves forward and back, and it moves in. So now when we think about those 2 light bulbs, between the light bulbs is a groove. And the olecranon moves into that groove. Okay. All right. So it's like, they call it the olecranon fossa. And a fossa is just an indentation in a bone that receives another bone. So that's a joint. Yeah. And depending on how deep your fossa is how far the olecranon will move forward. So if you have hyperextension, your olecranon is moving into a deeper fossa. Okay. Okay. Now we have fossas in the front as well that help limit range of motion. You can see this part. So the top of the ulna, if you look at it from the side, is a little bit like a half moon shape. You see that? Yeah. So the top of the half moon shape so there's the ulna, with my arm being the bone and the front and this is the elbow. So when you bend it, the elbow moves out, and when you straighten it, the elbow moves in. And when you bend it, this part moves in, right? So right. There's limitations, bony limitations forward and back to the elbow. So you can see this arm hyperextends because the olecranon is moving into that really deep fossa. Right. Sometimes there's a fossa front and back, which means that part of the bone is thinner than the sides. And sometimes there's even a hole. That's a variation. Okay. But you wouldn't know that unless you might see it on an x-ray.
And is it also possible that someone has a really shallow and so their arm is like, they can't straighten it? Or is that...
I would say that, I don't know for sure. I think if somebody cannot straighten their arm all the way, it's probably not the olecranon fossa unless they've had an injury. Okay. It's more probably contracture in the front. Okay. With some limitation in the soft tissue instead of the bones. So you see that in some weightlifters and people who get, really massive here. Yeah. They don't get full extension, but they don't get full flexion either because there's just too much mass. Right. So when you're flexing your elbow, you're going to reach soft tissue range of motion before you get bony, especially active, like you've got a really big bicep. So the size of your forearm and the size of your bicep will limit your active range of motion in right. flexion. You can usually get more passive. So if somebody pushes your arm down, you'll get more range of motion than if you can just pull it. Because when you're pulling it, the muscles are contracting, so they're creating their own kind of resistance there. Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about extension primarily. So the bony end range of motion is determined by the depth of the olecranon fossa, first and foremost. Right. So that's interesting because if you're not at full range of motion and you go for that plumb line or vertical arm in a handstand, you won't be at bony end range of motion, which feels really unstable. Yeah, for sure. So it's really uncommon to break your arm because of hyperextension in weight bearing, unless there's a lot of, if you're just static, like in a straight up and down handstand, it's unlikely to happen. But if you've got some momentum going, like if you're landing from a tumble or something, that's right. more likely. And what would usually happen is it breaks at the neck, right? So it would break around there. What's more likely to happen is soft tissue damage in the ligaments in the front.
Okay.
And if you're landing side to side, because the ulna articulates with the spool, that movement there is pure flexion and extension.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have any rotation at that point. So the ulna is it's a really kind of interesting joint to look at. The ulna does this forward and back thing. It shouldn't have any side to side. This, of course, model it lacks all the soft tissue and ligaments. So it has a little bit of wiggle room, but it wouldn't normally wiggle. And then the radius is the other bone in the forearm. And the radius ends in like a little golf tee that sits on the ball part.
Right.
On the side of the spool. And that's where you get rotation. So that bone can rotate relative. And it's got a little, you see the inside on the ulna, there's a little notch for it to sit.
Right.
So it's a beautiful system. Okay, so now let's talk about why some people have a carrying angle. Where does that come from in the joint? When you look at, it's called valgus, whenever there's a change in the orientation from straight out,
Mm-hmm.
right? So knee valgus is knock-kneed. And in the elbow, it's called cubitus valgus. So there's a certain amount that is considered normal, and then a considered amount that is considered dysfunctional. And it's anything outside of 15 degrees from this straight axis would be considered uncommon or unusual. So what we can do is, let's just measure our own carrying angle. So what's really interesting to me and why I started thinking about elbows so much is that I hyperextend normally,
mm-hmm.
and then I broke my radial head.
Right.
And and the guy, when I was in the hospital, they said, "Oh, you might need a radial head replacement." So that was interesting. It turned out that I didn't need anything. I didn't even need a cast. They just sent me home. But while I was waiting, every time someone came in and looked at my x-rays, they were like, "Oh, you're not leaving without a cast." I'm like, "Oh, you're going to have surgery." And so I got everything. And then finally, when the surgeon came in, he said, "Oh, this isn't a problem. Just go home."
Right.
So I have a chip off the radial head that is floating, but it's not going to impede the joint in any way. So they just decided not to do anything. But I couldn't straighten my elbow anymore. And it took a long time to get it this straight. It's 3 years now. So, and I did everything. I didn't do handstands, but I did a lot of hanging to try and get length in the ligaments and things like that. So there's damage to the capsule. There's damage to the ligament system. And that's primarily what the limiting factor is. Which is why I say that when, I know I have more bony range of motion there, but if I can't get it, it isn't because the bone, it just can't park.
Right.
Because the soft tissue is restricting it. So we're going to take our elbow crease and point it, it has to be right down under our shoulder. So the arm is pointing straight down. And take your fingers and find the sides of your light bulbs again, or the sides of your humerus. It's called the medial and the lateral sides. And with the elbow crease pointing straight ahead, start to flex your elbow and bring your hand towards your shoulder. So most people will, if you haven't moved your shoulder by rotating it or moving it in or out, a normal range of motion is wrist right over shoulder. But you can have variations where the hand will be inside the shoulder and outside. All right, mine is right over. It's dead center. So when I extend my elbow now, without moving, so you've got your fingers on the epicondyles of your humerus, so they don't move, and it's not movement of the shoulder. When you go to full extension, you can see that my wrist is outside of my shoulder. All right, so let me just get a straight line. So this is my shoulder, and that's the center. That's probably, 10 degrees or so. Mm-hmm. So I have a carrying angle. And it was considerably worse with this arm when it was broken because I couldn't straighten it. So sometimes when you look at something that looks like it's on the frontal plane, which means straight out to the sides, it's actually rotational.
Right.
So it's very interesting. So if I had an excessive carrying angle, I could make it look better by internally rotating my shoulder. See how that made it look like my hand is straight down under my shoulder.
Right.
Okay, so now let's talk about why we have that carrying angle. So we've got the two light bulbs coming down. We've got the spool sitting on the top of it. We've got the whole thing at the bottom angled forward, which means that when you straighten your arm and put your olecranon in the olecranon fossa, that if you're hyperextending, it's even further back than normal because everything is in that joint is forward.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the spool itself is not sitting on the sagittal plane. It's angled slightly, mm-hmm. so that the ball part of it, where the radial head sits, is angled slightly forward. And then if you think of a spool of thread, it's usually cylindrical and even, but there's actually a dip in the middle,
right? Kind
of like an hourglass, except it's not symmetrical like an hourglass. So it's an hourglass. The dip would be the same all the way around. This can have an angle to it,
okay,
or a spiral. So this is what determines where the hand is to the shoulder relative when it's extended, is that spiral. So I've got one part, the front part of it's called the trochlea, is the name of the bone, where the olecranon articulates with the bottom of your ulna. That spool part is called the trochlea.
Okay.
And then maybe I'm wrong. Let me just check that. It's one of them's the trochleum and one of them's the capitum. So let me just see. Yeah, that's the trochlea. I was right. And the capitulum or the capitum, I've seen both of them. Is where the radius articulates. That's the ball part. So the trochlea in my case, in the front, it's pretty sagittal. So if it were angled this way, my hand would be inside and vice versa. But when I go out, the back of my trochlea has a spiral that way, which sends my hand in that direction.
Right.
So that's what's going to determine the range of motion. It's not like there's nothing you can do about it, really.
Right.
It's the shape of your bones. So it is genetic in some way, you could say, but also usage. Because if you start doing something at a young age, your bones will take the shape of that, what they do most often. Your bones can change their shape just as easily, especially when you're young,
right,
as the soft tissue does. So now we've got an elbow that parks deeply and perhaps a trochlea that is angled differently, and then it has the spiral. So all of those things together will determine your anatomy in your elbow. Okay. Now, the radius, that's pretty interesting because if you put your fingers on the back on the sides of your elbow here, the back of your elbow, so you're on the upper arm bone, and you have your palm facing forward, and then you rotate it down. This is called pronation. This is called supination. We usually have 180 degrees or full supination, but when you pronate, see where I stopped? It's not full. All right. Now you have to be careful that you're not doing this. All right. So it's just the movement of the radial. It's an elbow movement. So you can do elbow and hand. But normally you don't have full pronation. You have full supination. So how we get our hand to the floor is either by gravity, just pushing it there. So you're rotating the bones of your hand at the wrist. Mm-hmm. Or you're rotating your shoulder to get your hand fully pronated when you're weight bearing on it. We're not talking about shoulder today, but that there is relevance because when you're at 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, you don't have as much rotation in your shoulder as you do when it's not in 180 degrees, like anywhere out of it. So that rotation might need, like you can rotate your elbow, as we discussed already, regardless of how straight or bent your elbow is, you can rotate your forearm bones. So that can help. So your elbow crease is kind of an indication of where the shoulder is sitting.
Right.
It's either neutral or not. So this would be an internally rotated shoulder. This would be externally rotated with the elbow crease pointing out.
And it's very hard for people to really maintain like that forward in full flexion. Like
and
that.
I wouldn't even, like, I don't even think it's normal to have that.
Right.
I think it's normal to have it to a certain point, and most people are deficient in like when they have to kind of give it up.
Right.
But when you're at 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, it shouldn't be
like
it shouldn't be pointing straight back. It should be pointing in a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. So that's normal. And if you take your arm at 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, you don't, like, you have pronation, supination, of course, but you really don't have, this is not movement at my shoulder joint. This is movement of my shoulder blade.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you really have almost no rotation of your shoulder at that point. So if you're telling people externally rotate your shoulders, like as an image, maybe, because they might get some movement of their shoulder blades, but it's not literally rotation of the shoulder. But it could be pronation and supination deficiency, right? Getting the hand to the ground and then being in full flexion. That's extension of the wrist. So the radial head, if you hold the ends of so if I'm starting, this is supinated, and I have a 10 degree of carrying angle, when I pronate, that helps because it turns the radius around the ulna, so it's crossed now, and my hand is more directly under my shoulder. Mm-hmm. So if you see that here, let me see. So there's a supinated, fully extended supinated hand. So this is the radius. It's going to rotate that way. So that means the hand moves in relatively, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So you can see that looks, I'm going to just exaggerate it. That looks more like a carrying angle than this does. Okay. So pronation itself helps a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to me how that works. So if you feel down in your forearm, so if you have really big muscles, just find the sharper edge of the ulna. Yeah. And then if you take your thumb towards the ceiling and then back again, there's no movement under your fingers. Yeah. Because the movement is the other bone. And it's coming over the front and crossing in. Okay. So just that act, so like kind of standing like this, if you have a bigger carrying angle, just the kind of rotating your hand this way, which you would need to do for your handstand, is going to help. It's going to help that. So, if somebody was really worried about the carrying angle, they could look at how much pronation you have, because some people there's a range of motion that is full supination and then not quite full pronation. So I can't remember offhand. I might have it in my notes and I'll look in a minute. But the range of motion is not 180 degrees supination or pronation. It's just you get full and then you're just short, like maybe 10 degrees of pronation. So if they have less than that, then they're going to have to get the movement to get their hand to the ground from the shoulder, which, as we just discussed, is not available when you're at 180 degrees of flexion. So I would make pronation and supination more of a training warm up or something, than trying to force the shoulders into a certain position. And the elbow you can't do anything about. So and then if they, so most people are concerned with, is there potential damage? Should I be doing this? How can I do it if I'm hyperextended safely? Right. And if people are telling you when you're weight bearing on your hands, which is really uncommon and unnatural, I'll say, thing to do, that telling somebody to bend their elbows a little bit so that their arm is vertical is not helping. Yeah. So
can say that from experience as well.
Right. It feels very unstable. Yeah. Like I know when I broke mine, if I put my hands, like, because I don't do full handstands. I used to, but I don't anymore. And but I do things like, because weight bearing on my hands I think is important. So I do weight bearing activities. And one of the things I'll do is like I'll put a bolster up against a wall and then put a chair facing the wall. And I put my spine up against the bolster, so there's a space for my hands.
Yep.
And then I put my feet on the chair and I just walk my feet up to like the top of the chair. So I'm in an L shape. And that's weight bearing enough for me. And that was almost impossible at the beginning. Terrifying.
Right.
Like it really felt like I was going to buckle and break my neck or something. So there's no sense of security at all. So you don't want to take that away from people. But I think it comes down to an it depends situation. So and it depends on so many variables. Like what is the degree of hyperextension and carrying angle? Are they like, what is the condition of their soft tissue, their what do you call it, like your bones and your ligaments and muscles and things like that, if they have hypermobility syndrome or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you don't want to put somebody like me who's got very lax ligaments in a position where only their bones are going to be the thing that is holding them out.
Right. You
want all three of those things to be part of that stability structure. So you've got bony and range of motion. Once you're there, you're there. So if you are severely hyperextending, let's say, then you are going to be relying more on the soft tissue than other people.
Yeah.
And that might be something that you need to train so that, you're training that in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, of course, is muscles. And you're doing all the things that, if you're only doing handstands, I would assume that that's not as good as doing things like chin-ups and pulling and, all the things that would help your muscles be strong in every situation.
Yeah. So in terms of like strength, like kind of working the ligaments and muscles and stuff in that end range, is that just like, doing things like full range of motion bicep curls? Like, is that a good kind of thing just to strengthen that end range? Or is it more like also training pull-ups and also training like this kind of part of the bicep curl, right, less than this, like what?
Well, I think in muscles, eccentric activity is generally more strength building than concentric. So you can do things like, I don't know what all the names of these things are because this is not my I do something different. But when you're hanging from a bar and you just lower yourself slowly, right? Revert, what do you call those?
Yeah, like an eccentric.
Yeah, so chin-up, pull-up. You can make that more of your, a focus than the pull-up part.
Right.
Yeah, and like muscles, you got this. Like, how to strengthen muscles so that your tendons are part of the structure that holds your joints safely in whatever you're trying to do. But it's the ligaments that you can't really train. So those are the things that you have to be cautious of. So if you're really a severe hyperextender, you are going to be putting more load on the ligaments in the front of your arm. And the ligament system, thankfully, is very robust. And there's a ligament that runs across both of the lower arm bones like a cuff. Right. And this rotates within the cuff. So when there's I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's very common when children are young and the head of the radius is not fully formed, so it's smaller. Okay. So it can slip out of the cuff easily. So it's called nursemaid's elbow. All right. And if the kid is like, pick me up, and you grab them by the wrists and do this, you can pull the radial head right out of that ligament. Okay. It's a dislocation. And the only other way you can dislocate your arm is if, because of the way that this, half moon sits on the spool, it's really quite sturdy as it is, just as a joint. But, and there shouldn't be side to side movement. But there are ligaments on the sides that if you were to break, this would be able to slip out. So that dislocation and breaks are, they're the main concerns. Mm-hmm. And it's very uncommon to do that. The person would have to be either really weak, really extreme, have some kind of problem with their connective tissue that hopefully you would know about before you put them in a handstand. So I'm not too worried about that in terms of, somebody with a hyperextension and a carrying angle doing a handstand, it just looks weird.
Yeah.
So work on the pronation, work on the structural stuff that you can work on to help the stabilizer, so that you're taking some of that responsibility off the ligaments.
Yeah.
And the bones are going to be where they are.
Yeah.
So I guess you could say some people were made to do handstands and some weren't, but if you really are dying to do a handstand and you're one of those people, it's not like bad or wrong, right?
Right.
It's not detrimental unless you go in it without knowing how to stabilize.
Yeah. And I think if you look at like hand balancers, like a lot, especially female hand balancers, will have hyperextended elbows. So there's lots of evidence there that it can be strong, it can be stable, and it can be really safe. And
so I have a mentor who's an anatomy teacher, and
Katy.
No, it's actually someone else. Eileen Berg. She's in Nelson, and I've worked with her for 15 years. And so I asked her about elbows. I said, "Do you have anything that you can, contribute to this discussion that I know I'm going to have?" And she said, "Well, I'll ask I think it's her sister or sister-in-law or somebody who's a gymnastics coach." And she said in 30 years of training, she's only had 3 elbow injuries. And those 3 were all off something that, had some movement in it.
Yeah. Yeah. I broke this elbow. I broke my elbow, but it was a fall from like above, like a high bar, falling on the ground.
Yeah. Right.
And I actually don't have a radial head. So they gave me a radial head replacement, and then I broke that. Oh. And so they just took it out. Because it was stable. The elbow was stable. And so, so my elbow actually, because there's no radial head, like if you grab it, it can kind of bend sideways a little bit. But
interesting. So, because that is, let me see if this is here. And the radial head is gone.
So it does kind of bend. It can.
Because there's, as I said, the radius articulates with the ulna as well, right? Mm-hmm. And it has like, you see that little notch in the ulna right there? Yeah. Where the round part sits. So if that's not there to receive that, then there probably is a little sideways movement. Yeah.
And like doing rings training, if anyone else does rings training, I find that like very common is to try and turn the rings out. Yeah. And that position is so painful for me just because my elbow doesn't like. Yeah. Doesn't like it. So
I always wonder when they do things like that. What else did they do? Like they never tell you about the soft tissue stuff. Right.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Because it's like where, like you were talking about the ligament.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, did they leave that? Yeah, where's that? They sew it up. What did they do? It's just flopping around in there. So I think that's about all. Is there any other questions that you can think of? That I'm just going to run through my notes to make sure I didn't.
No, I think that's. Amazing. So much good information there, and like really useful stuff, like training the pronation and locking out that bony end range is, that's the stable position, and then it's working the muscles and stuff. So really, really helpful. And also the stuff about the shoulder. So we'll have to have another conversation now about shoulders at some point.
I think I got everything. So here's the range of motion. In flexion, which is here, 140 to 145 degrees. This is normal. I'm just talking about average. Average is 140 to 145 active, or 160 passive. So you can get 15 degrees more, flexion if you push on it.
I have quite limited flexion on the one I broke.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's.
See, look at mine is different too. Yeah.
I don't know if that. It's still not great on this side, but I don't know if that is a bony thing. I would guess it's more soft tissue, but
I'm not sure about that because I'm deficient too. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
So, and I, a few degrees from extension. So I've lost range of motion both degrees, and there's nothing wrong with my joint as far as I know. Like I've seen the X-rays and MRIs and it looks normal. It's just the soft tissue damage. So something in there is extension. This is considered 0. Okay. So if you're beyond 0, you're hyperextended. And hyperextension is 5 to 10 degrees beyond zero.
Okay.
So if you're anywhere outside of 10 degrees, that's pretty hyperextended.
Right.
That's, in the dysfunctional range of motion.
Cool.
Yeah. But that's a word, right? You can still be functional in a dysfunction. Like you can still have normal function and be able to do things like a handstand.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just have to know that, okay, you're a special case, right? You've got to work a little harder.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. Good.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was, that was fantastic. Thank you.
I hope it makes sense. And sometimes these simple models help you kind of visualize what's going on inside.
Yeah.